Oh, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Fire's just getting going, and it sounds like the wind is beginning to kick up out there. I'm so glad I can give you a nice cozy place to spend your mornings here on Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. So let's get into some great stories while I share with you some of my favorites from across my wide range of wonderful stories. This first one hits a little close to home, since yours truly is a Josh himself. This was a little bit of a joke back in the day, some giant fight involving all the Joshes, but I thought, what if that was just something we said, so no one would look a little closer into it? How would it feel to be the last Josh?
I've been in a coma for the last 6 months. I was fortunate, they say. The semi-truck that hit my car killed my mother and my fiancé, but spared me. Well, not spared, I guess. I had 2 broken legs and a shattered collarbone, and I was in a persistent vegetative state for 6 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. I awoke on April 26, 2021. I couldn't heed the call, and that's why I'm the last Josh. The news is still coming in from across the world as people kept finding bodies. The occurrence had been as sudden as it was unexplainable. The death toll is estimated to be nearly 1 million, all from different states, different countries, different walks of life. It's being called one of the most devastating events of the 20th century, and the level of cover-up going on to keep the public outcry to a minimum is alarming. They're trying to say that it's nothing but a meme, an internet joke, a fun fight that happened with pool noodles and foam swords. The truth is that on April 24th, for some reason, everyone named Josh just kind of snapped. I didn't know this at first, of course. When I woke up, the hospital staff was just glad I had woken up. The doctor had been hopeful, but every coma's different. I was the subject of a lot of attention for the first few hours as they told me what happened and tried to get in touch with any family I might have in the area. My dad died when I was little. My grandparents on both sides have been dead for years, and I have no other siblings. I was alone, no family or future family since my fiancé was dead, and I was having a lot of trouble processing it. That was the first time I heard about the Josh battle. One of the techs was taking my vitals, and he mentioned it offhandedly. "Shame you were in a coma, kid. You missed the big Josh fight." I blinked a little confused. I'm sorry? "The Josh fight. It's a whole thing. Look," he elaborated. He pulled out his phone and showed me a bunch of happy, smiling people fighting with foam weapons and pool noodles and other padded things. They seemed to be having a great time, and it stuck with me long after the tech took his phone and continued his rounds. Why would they call it a Josh fight? It appeared to be some silly thing that had happened suddenly, but I couldn't do any research on my own. My phone had been destroyed in the accident, and with no immediate family to talk to, I was in the dark until the next day. That was when Brown arrived. I'd woken up from a nap and found a dark-haired man sitting in my hospital room. He wore thick black glasses, had short brown hair, and wore a close-cropped beard that looked patchy. He smiled when he saw me, putting his phone in his pocket and giving me his full attention. "Good, you're awake. I've been waiting for you to wake up. Are you with billing or something? I have insurance if that's what you're—" He waved me off. No, nothing like that. "My name's Brown. I'm here to inform you that you are one of the last Joshes on Earth." I raised an eyebrow. Is that some kind of joke? There are millions of Joshes on Earth. How the hell can I be one of the last? Well, it's a long story, and no one's quite sure why this thing happened at all. What we do know is that 2 days ago, all the people named Josh suffered from an unexplainable psychotic break that seems to have struck them all at once. It lasted for 24 hours, and when it was done, they all returned to normal with no memories of what they had done. If that's true, then why am I still in this hospital bed? I was pretty sure he was just some crackpot who had wandered in, but I was just bored enough to entertain his crazy ideas. "Well, you may not have gone anywhere, but the nurses tell me that you tried. You apparently bucked around in your bed and had to be restrained until the end of the day. At midnight, you stopped convulsing, and when morning came, you were still unmoving, and they released you from your restraints. 2 days later, you woke up. Does this have anything to do with this Josh fight people keep talking about? He made a rude noise. That's bullcrap. It was all staged to make people doubt. In a few days, when people start reporting the missing, and work records show that people have missed a week of work, they'll start putting the pieces together. Here, he said, putting down a brown satchel at the foot of my bed. You can use this to see the facts we've compiled after I've gone. I have a feeling it will help you accept the facts as we see them. He got up then, pushing his chair back up against the wall and saying he'd see me tomorrow. Watch the videos. Let me know what you think. I'll be back for your thoughts later. And with that, he was gone. The videos were in a folder on the desktop. They were time-stamped, each of them ordered by when the incident took place. I put my mouse over the first, occurring at 8:15 that morning, and clicked play on the video. What popped up was a rip of a Facebook Live video. It was clearly shot from a cell phone, and the shaky cam was a little disorienting. It showed two people, one filming and one hovering just outside of camera view, as they followed a tall farm boy through the halls of the school. He was strong-looking, his corn silk hair swinging around his shoulders, and he looked more than a little confused as he blundered along. Alright, so this guy came blundering out of his class, almost hit my friend with the door, and now he's just walking up the halls. His teacher was freaking out for a minute, but he just kept walking. We thought he might be looking for something, so we followed him to see what was going on. The big farm boy walked through the halls, like a trapped animal fleeing prey. His head snapped furtively right and left at every intersection, and he seemed driven to find something. The boys laughed as they followed him, thinking it was a joke or some kind of prank. He had cut down 3 more halls before he found what he was looking for, and the two oohed and hooted when the farm boy locked eyes with a smaller boy in a button-down shirt at the end of the hall. The 2 boys commented about the big farm boy having found his boyfriend, but to me, they looked like gunslingers getting ready to draw. When the smaller boy charged the bigger one, it took the farm boy completely by surprise. When his nose popped, as the smaller boy jumped and headbutted him, the other 2 stopped laughing. The 2 fought, punching and kicking, as the larger one quickly gained the advantage. His hands found their way around the smaller boy's throat, as the doors to the classroom started opening. The students rushed out to see what the commotion was. Suddenly, another boy punched a bigger one in the back of the head. Then another boy jumped into the fray. Suddenly, others were piling in, and the teachers and administrators were trying to separate them. When an adult dived into one of the other teachers as he tried to separate the combatants, his thumbs found the boy's eyes and pressed them into his skull, the screaming taking on a different level. Students were running, people were screaming, and the blood started to run down the struggling boy's face. The camera was knocked from the recorder's hand, and the video stopped suddenly. The next video was from 8:30, and it seemed to be from a traffic cam. Cars drove beneath the light, taking turns and waiting for their chance to cross. Suddenly, a car T-boned another car, and the drivers climbed out and began punching and kicking indiscriminately. One of them slammed the other's hand in the car door, pinning him, and as the man writhed, the other punched him until his blood flew across the side of the vehicle. Then he took his head and put it through the passenger side window, raking his throat across the glass as the blood sheeted down like a waterfall. After he was done, the man ran off down the street and out of camera view. I furrowed my eyebrows. What the hell was I watching? What did this video have to do with anything? Brown had collected a bunch of videos from fights. Big deal. What did any of this have to do with the supposed Josh fight? The stuff I had seen online was the fun kind of fighting. These videos were brutal. I got my answer in video 6. The next 3 videos were more traffic cam footage. A man in a hard hat suddenly landed on a man on the sidewalk, punching him even as he died from the fall. It appeared he had jumped right from the building they were constructing, but it was hard to tell for sure. The next was a pair of men suddenly running into camera view and slugging it out. One of them pulled out a knife and slit the other one's throat, but he continued to try to strangle him until he finally died in a pool of his own blood. The 5th was another vehicular crash. One of the drivers pulled the other driver out of the car, but it appeared he had died on impact. He left him on the street and ran off somewhere, just as the video ended. The weirdest part was, all 5 of these videos had happened at different times and in different places. 3 of the videos had clearly taken place in the United States, but one of them looked like it might be from Asia, and the last one had decidedly been in Europe, given the driving patterns. It was the weirdest thing. Why had he given me these videos? What was the point? As the sixth video started, I saw it was another cell phone cam. A man in a mall was drowning a child in a fountain. The scene looked vaguely Middle Eastern, and the people around them weren't speaking any language I understood. A woman was beating at the man's shoulder, trying to stop him, but she just kept repeating the same name again and again and again as she pounded weakly at the man. It was the only word I could understand, and the familiarity chilled me a little bit. Joshua, 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 Joshua. Have you ever been in a crowded place and heard someone calling your name? They aren't talking to you, but the sound of your name turns you to see who it is. Maybe it's even someone you know. Maybe it's someone you know who's being called. On a baser level, it's a desire to see someone else that has your name. We want to see who else has our name and, for a few seconds, feel a sense of brotherhood with them. You're two people amongst many, and such things make us feel strange, maybe a sense of togetherness as well. Hearing my name called as she begged him to stop drowning what could have very well been his own son made me feel a shared sense of horror. Horror that my own namesake could do such a thing. Horror that I might be capable of something like that. Video 7 was body cam footage of someone named Officer Grigg. Officer Grigg was running through a maze of small concrete corridors, talking to someone on the radio and begging for help. His partner had gone crazy. His partner had killed a kid, and now he was chasing him. Other officers were on the way, but Officer Grigg had heard shots from the complex up ahead. He was terrified that his partner had killed someone else. He came into the courtyard and froze, hugging the wall as he drew his gun. When he peeked around, I could see that the courtyard had 6 bodies sprawled out around the corner. They'd been killed as they tried to charge him, and as Officer Grigg peeked, he saw another crazy man running at the cornered officer. He shot him, his head exploding in a puff of red, and he fell down with the others in a twitching mass. Grigg stepped up then, training his gun on his partner as he approached slowly. "Mulder, just put it down, man. We can talk about this. We can..." Mulder turned to look at him, his eyes glazed and unseeing, just before his head snapped to the side and he fell against the wall. Grigg spun and fired without looking, and the last image I saw was another officer sliding down the wall, his eyes far away and his expression slack. The camera zoomed in on the dead officer's nameplate, and I read J. Myers. The next few videos were much like the others. Street fights, car accidents that turned violent, shaky videos that caught random acts of violence, and throughout all of them, people sometimes screamed Josh or Joshua. I wasn't sure how many I had watched, but the end result was always the same: murder, death, pain. I looked at the videos in that folder and felt sick. There were so many of them. I had watched less than 1/10 of them. There could be 10,000 on this laptop. How many of them would be like the ones I had seen before? Just random acts of violence that were not so random in the end. How many Joshes had really died that day because something in their heads told them to? I exited out of the folder, and that's when I saw a second folder that I had missed on first inspection. J. Holder was in the subject line in all caps. When I opened the folder, there were 7 videos inside. The first was at 8:30, and it looked like it might be another security cam video. The other 5 videos happened between 9:50 and midnight, with the 7th being around 5 a.m. I was hesitant to begin these videos, but there was something intriguing about them. Why had they been separated? Who was this guy? Joshua Holder, I assumed. I opened the first video and found footage from a convenience store CCTV. A blond man in a black t-shirt was standing in line, waiting his turn. He was fidgeting, the old lady in line taking longer than she strictly needed to, and I could see him sigh as he tapped his foot. He had some snacks and a drink in his hand, and it looked like any other day in any other town. Then, and I had to rewind the video a few times to catch it, his eyes glazed over, and the snacks fell out of his hand. The owner must have yelled at him, because he looked up and made eye contact as the woman at the counter turned to look at him. Then, he rushed the counter, vaulted over it, and was lost to view as the woman screamed wordlessly and ran from the store. 5 minutes later, he left. His fists were bleeding, and his face looked to be dripping with something. The second video was at 9:50. It was short, less than a minute. A car was stopped at a light, waiting for the green light, when Holder approached the vehicle. He reached in, slammed the driver's face against the steering wheel, and dragged them from the car. Putting his head under the tire, he then proceeds to climb behind the wheel and drive away. The red smear on the concrete told me everything I needed to know. The third video was another body cam shot at 10:40. An officer identifies himself as Officer Felder and tells us that he's approaching the car for a routine traffic stop. As he comes up to the window, I saw Holder's face staring blankly back at him. Officer Felder begins his rehearsed line, but suddenly tapers off as he reaches for his gun. Holder pulls a gun from beside the door as the officer is fumbling with the strap and shoots him 6 times. As he falls, we see Holder dragging him back into his squad car, leaving the stolen vehicle behind. At 11:20, I got my next video of Holder. The next video is a security camera, seeing a police officer gunning down people in a courtyard. The video is familiar, though, and when I saw an officer peek around the corner, I realized it was the same one that I'd been watching earlier. It was Officer Grigg, as he tried to subdue his partner, but I was seeing it from a different angle. As Grigg approached, gun out but speaking soothingly, I could see Holder stepping out from another alley and leveling a pistol. He was wearing a uniform he had likely stolen from a cop, and after he shot, he stepped back out of sight. The other officer ran in then, and Griggs put him down without thinking. The next video, the fifth, was another CCTV video. A man in a uniform was walking through a crowded mall. People were running, screaming soundlessly as he gunned them down. Each shot was precise, each kill was clean, and only men seemed to fall at his hands. The footage whipped through a couple of different cameras, and the officer was deadly as he proceeded. In all, I watched him kill 7 men before he approached the door to the food court, flashing lights visible beyond. That was 4 p.m. by the timestamp. The next video was at 10, and it was news footage of Holder surrendering. He was getting on his knees, dressed in a blood-stained uniform, and police were taking him into custody. The news anchor was saying how Jeffrey Holder was responsible for the deaths of 15 people and had led police on a murder spree that had been capped off with his murder of 7 people at the Bayview Mall. Police did not believe he had any accomplices and were just glad to have the situation under control. But wait, I rewound the video as the name clicked. Jeffrey Holder, not Joshua Holder? Something didn't add up. I opened the last video, waving away an orderly with a dinner tray as I realized it was 7 at night. These videos had engrossed me for hours. I was sickened by them, shocked by them, but they had drugged me in and made me watch. These were my people dying, and I was reveling in the new sort of shared camaraderie. I was mourning for them as they fell. I was horrified for them as they succumbed to their baser instincts, and I was dreading what depravity might come next. Then there was this Jeffrey Holder, the worst of them all. I loaded up the last video and saw another security camera video of Holder in an interrogation cell. He was sitting at a long white table, hands cuffed to a metal ring, fidgeting as he had been in the convenience store. He was testing his restraints, checking his exits, and when the doors opened, a detective walked in to question him. The questions were expected. Why did you kill these people? What are your motives? Why did you do this? On and on and on. He sat there through it all in silence. Then the detective made a grave mistake. He leaned in close, wanting to ask Holder something quietly so the camera would have trouble hearing it. When Holder sank his teeth into his nose, he looked extremely surprised. When Holder had finished mutilating him, a scene that was very Silence of the Lambs, he maneuvered himself around and snaked the detective's key. A few short minutes later, and he was heading out the door that the detective had come in through. The camera continued to record the room as the detective's blood pooled there. When Brown came back the next day, I had moved 5 more videos into the Holder file. "You've been busy," he commented when I showed him. What happened after he escaped?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know, but needing to know. He made his way down to lockup with the detective's ID, killed a guard, and shot 7 men that were being held for violent crimes they'd committed that day. I'm pretty sure you can guess what their names were. He just kept killing, even after the rest snapped out of it. By the end of the 24 hours, there were very few left to snap out of it. The ones who fought and won snapped back at midnight. I remember coming to in a parking garage with blood on my hands and a knife in my pocket. I ran home, showered, and spent the rest of the day wondering what the hell had happened. Those who were unable to kill others, incarcerated or committed individuals, took their own lives in a fit of rage. The ones who were in a coma or were unable to take their own lives are all that's left. The final total is something like 5,000 Joshes worldwide. Why has no one noticed? I asked, astonished. Someone has, because they've been using the media to cover it up. They've been spreading false information in order to make people think it's a joke, a meme. But when people start noticing that their loved ones haven't come home, it'll be a little harder to sweep under the rug. Before he left, I asked him one more question. He had let me keep the laptop, telling me to observe the videos and see if I could find any more Holder sightings, which led me to my last question. I had seen him escape. I knew he had killed once, but I didn't know why. Why would he snap like that? He isn't a Josh. Also, why kill us? Brown shrugged. Who knows? All we know is that no one has seen him since the incident, and we're pretty interested in finding out where he is and what he's been up to. That was a week ago. Brown stopped returning my emails 2 days ago, and that's worrisome. The group he belongs to, a group of Joshes on Reddit, have been monitoring some things. They've noticed more Josh-related deaths since the incident. Someone is killing them. Someone is tracking us down, and I fear that Brown may be their latest victim. The message I got in my email yesterday was pretty clear about that. I will finish what I started, it said. It was signed, J. Holder.
It's a little chilly right now to consider a camping trip, but pretty soon it'll be that golden time of year where we all think about maybe taking to the woods and byways and doing a little camping of our own. In the spirit of that, let's hear about some scouts out doing what they do best, which is camping and telling scary stories. Let's hear about the last camping trip.
It was just supposed to be a typical camping trip with my scout troop. My friends and I were so excited, Davey, Kevin, and I. We always look forward to these camping trips, and the yearly autumn campout was one of the best. We took a bus to Grayson Falls, a huge state park with so many lakes to swim in, trails to hike, and several caves to explore. All the local scout troops would be there, 10 in all, and we would meet in Starfall campgrounds for the jamboree. There would be canoe races and s'mores and, of course, the annual scary story contest. All three of us had been crafting our stories since the last jamboree, and this year we were ready to take that prize. As the bus pulled up to the campsite, we all spilled out of it excitedly. We were the first to arrive, the others getting there tomorrow, but Scoutmaster Larry had wanted us to get there early so we could get the best spots. As I stood in the center of the campground, watching the other scouts mill about, going about their preparations and such, I couldn't help but soak in the sounds and smells of the surrounding forest. Grayson State Park had always been my favorite place to camp, and it was chiefly because it exuded this energy of safety and adventure. It was a maintained park, the park rangers keeping the animals in check and the forest peeled back from the areas where hikers and campers stayed. Even so, it wasn't too hard to imagine a wolf or a bear watching you from the tree line, just waiting to pounce on you unexpectedly. It wasn't too far-fetched to think that something mysterious or unknown could be lurking in those woods as well. We set up our tent a little further back than the others. Scoutmaster Larry had given us a set area where we could pitch our tents, and we had set our own tents at the edge of this. We wanted to feel like real scouts, like trailblazers, and I imagined us like old-timey explorers as Kevin and I set up our tents. Davey had disappeared, and I assumed he was getting water or firewood or something. No sooner had I set up my tent, though, than Davey hissed at us from the woods. "Nice campsite, but follow me if you girls want to do some real camping." He motioned us into the woods. But Scoutmaster Larry said," Kevin stammered. "Who cares what Scoutmaster Larry said? Do you want to camp or what?" We looked at each other. I did feel pulled by adventure, and Kevin, despite being kind of a wet blanket, seemed to feel it too. We nodded, and Davey set out his plan. We would leave our tents here as decoys, since they were already set up, and move off into the woods. Davey knew of a place where we could set up his tent, and we could do some actual camping for the night, away from the adults and the other scouts.
It would be like camping on our own, being explorers and roughing it for real. But what if they come looking for us? Kevin asked. Davy just waved his hand at the question. We'll go back to eat, and then after dinner we'll head back to the site. We'll wake up before anyone else gets good and stirring tomorrow, and be back in the camp before anyone notices. I had to admit, it wasn't a bad plan. We would strike our camp after tonight and rejoin the jamboree tomorrow as the others arrived. No one would miss us for one night, not with so many other scouts around. Kevin and I agreed to go look at the campsite first, wanting to see where he had put it before committing to staying the night there. As we plunged into the forest, Davy led the way. We took no trail, our feet following new ground as they led us to the campsite. As we went, I felt as though I could feel something watching us. It was still early afternoon and the forest was alive with the sounds of nature, but this tickling on the back of my neck felt a little sinister somehow. I turned to glance around as we went, but I saw nothing more dangerous than a blue jay or a squirrel. I decided I was being silly, and caught up with Kevin and Davy as we headed for our secret campsite. Even Kevin had to admit that the campsite was pretty cool. It was set in a small clearing, and complete with a fire pit that led me to believe that other scouts had used this site before. His tent almost looked out of place here, and I could just imagine scouts before us sleeping under the stars in sleeping bags. Davy asked us what we thought, and I could see that both of us were sold on the idea. We had agreed to come back after dinner, and thus we returned to the group. The rest of the day went fairly uneventfully. We returned to find a hike about to begin, so we tagged along as Scoutmaster Larry showed us nature's glory. We were a little nervous that they might happen upon our campsite, but the hike took us around the nearby creek and up to a natural waterfall that led from the lake nearby. As we returned, Scoutmaster Larry had our dinner cooking on a small fire near the counselor's tent. We set about preparing for the meal, and soon we were all stretched out on the grass eating campfire stew and hardtack bread. As we ate, Scoutmaster Larry laid out the day's events for tomorrow's jamboree. It would be a whole day of canoe races, decathlon contests, and all of it capped off by the scary story reading and the s'more roast. All of us were chattering quietly as we headed off to bed, the sun setting behind us as the three of us pretended to head to our tents. As the sun set low, we moved into the woods and made our way to our campground. As we followed Davy into the woods, I began to hear something strange in the surrounding green. It started as an overriding noise, making Kevin and Davy hard to hear even at close proximity. Davy was too excited to even acknowledge it at first, but I saw Kevin shooting furtive looks into the surrounding woods. The sounds of the forest seemed to be higher than I had ever heard them, and the deeper we went, the louder it seemed to become. The birds sounded like a flock, squawking and chattering animatedly to each other, and many of them sounded like species not even native to the region. As scouts, we were taught to identify local birds. It's for a badge, and many of these sounded different from the finches and quails you usually heard this time of year. I heard deer grunting and the yowls of cats, the growls of a bear, and even the throaty howl of a wolf. The strangest thing of all is, it wasn't the sound or the presence of non-native animals that had me scared. The strangest thing was that each cry was exactly the same. Same sound, same volume, same everything. The others could hear it too, but they were pretending they couldn't for some reason. We could all hear the sounds of animals, all of them much too loud. Kevin was starting to cry. Davy kept insisting that once we made it to the campsite, everything would be okay. He was pulling Kevin along now, Davy's hand wrapped around his wrist. Kevin was nearly frozen with fear, and I could see his eyes shining as he was half drugged through the trail. When we reached the tent, we all went straight in, not daring to even start a fire. We huddled in our tent, Kevin hyperventilating, as Davy and I peeked through the flap. The forest was still very loud, very populated, but it seemed to stop at our campsite. It was like a song heard from behind a door. You know the song, but the words are muffled. We watched the woods, both of us agreeing that we couldn't go back. We would have to stay the night, and Davy thought that we should probably sleep in shifts, too. There's definitely something out there. If we sleep in shifts, we can catch it if it tries to sneak up on us. I agreed, but for the moment, the two of us just watched the woods. The noises were moving away, like a troupe of actors on the move, and Kevin came to join us as well. We spent an hour just watching the woods, and I was surprised when I looked over to find Kevin snoring in the corner. The adrenaline was kicking out, and we were all getting tired. I told Davy I was going to lie down as well, but I just couldn't get comfortable. I was so tired, but my mind wouldn't shut off. I lay there, angrily tossing for what felt like hours, and that was probably why I heard them. I had just started to doze off when the first of the voices scraped across my senses.
I woke up to find Davy and Kevin stirring, roused by the voices outside the tent as well. They were familiar voices, campers and scoutmasters we knew, all of them calling our names. They were out in the woods at night searching for us, and their voices clattered through the dark wilderness in a jarring way. They were too loud somehow, disturbing the perfect silence of the night. They also seemed wrong, like the animal sounds from earlier. Each of them was the exact same name, called in the exact same way, again and again. Davy opened the tent, looking out into the darkness for a flashlight. The forest was still dark, the crickets and the night birds alarmingly silent. The quiet of the night was disturbed only by the yelling searchers, and the sounds of their voices were making my skin crawl. Kevin seemed shaken as the voices grew closer and closer. Maybe we should just go to them, guys. They're going to be mad if they find us out here. We should just say we were out here using the bathroom or something. His voice shook as he said it, and I could tell he was getting ready to bolt. Kevin was the type who feared getting in trouble more than silly things like possible death. Davy turned away from the flap to look at him. Are you crazy? If we stay right where we are, they'll never find us. Kevin didn't seem so sure, though. As we stood at the tent flap, watching the woods and listening to the voices, Kevin made a sound like a wounded cat and made a break for the woods. He shoved past us and went running into the brush, yelling that he was sorry for making them look for him. We heard him apologize up until his yells were suddenly cut off. He was stammering apologies one minute, and the next, he was silent as the grave. Davy and I stood looking out into the woods, shuddering in the sudden stillness that held sway across the dark green world. Then, as suddenly as they had stopped, the voices began again. We could hear Kevin's voice amongst them, calling for us to come out. Davy, I said, both of us still looking out into the woods, my eyes having just realized something my brain should have a long time ago. If they're out there looking for us, why don't they have flashlights? Davy contemplated this, and it seemed to scare him just as much as it scared me. We went back inside, huddling in our tent as the voices grew closer and closer. Davy zipped up the doorway and walked backwards into the suddenly flimsy canvas tent. He seemed afraid to turn his back to the doorway and just sort of stood in the middle as he kept his eyes fixed on the secured opening. I hunkered in my sleeping bag, listening to the voices call our names as they came closer and closer. Davy shuddered, cocking his head like a dog who hears a noise. He suddenly took a step back towards the door, and I yelled at him to get away from there. I hunkered down in my sleeping bag, hearing the voices calling our names, and my tears were wet as they slid nakedly down my face. We were trapped out here, alone, with no one to help us. Why hadn't we just stayed with the others? I sunk deeper into my bag, hoping I would wake up to find out this had all been a dream and feel silly for letting it scare me. I opened my eyes as the zipper door slid open. I looked out to find Davy standing in the doorway, looking at the voices that seemed to surround our tent. I begged him to close it, begged him to come back, but he only glanced back at me, almost apologetically. The moon cast his face in stark relief, turning him into a carved totem, and then he turned and stepped out into the night. He left the tent open, and I heard him scream as whatever was calling to us got him. His scream was high and long, cutting through the monotonous calling like an axe through a melon. It cut off at the peak of his terror, and the sound of it ending made me bunch down in the sleeping bag all the more. The next time I heard his voice was when it joined that frightening chorus, all of them now calling for me. I put my hands over my ears, trying to block them out. I wanted them to stop. I wanted this all to be over, and I sat shuddering, suddenly becoming aware that I couldn't hear anything. I pulled my hands away from my ears, slowly at first, and heard nothing but the silence of the outside night. I looked at the flap of the tent and found only the soft rustle of the fabric against the zipper as I began to worm my way out of my warm cocoon. I got about half out when suddenly they were all around me. Their hands pushed at the walls of the tent. Their faces were canvas-covered masks as they tried to push their way inside. I could see their terrible features and hear their ragged breathing as they all shoved at the thin barrier of my tent. There were so many of them, adults, children, animals, and others who resembled nothing so much as skeletons with vaguely human shapes. A shadow fell onto the floor of my dwelling, and I looked to see one framed in the doorway. I zipped my sleeping bag shut then, and hunkered down at the bottom, a snail trapped inside its shell.
Outside, I could hear the monotonous voices surrounding me again, moving in for the kill as I shuddered at the bottom of my sleeping bag. When I heard the metallic zipper, I knew I was done for. The creature sank its face into the mouth of the sleeping bag, and I cowered as its bony lips peeled back in a mirthless smile. It opened its mouth. It screamed my name, lunging at me with its bony teeth, its pale white skull luminescent in the darkness. I died with the sound of my own name fighting against the rippling scream that rode up my throat. The scouts around the fire looked at me as though I was from another planet. The campfire was the only sound, the logs crackling merrily as the collected troops sat looking at me as I stood in the story circle. Even some of the scoutmasters looked a little rattled by my story, but slowly they started to clap. Scoutmaster Larry clapped the loudest, shaking his hand as he approached. "Now I see why you wanted to go last. That would have been a hard story to top. I think we can agree which story wins this year's Jamboree Short Story Contest." The applause picked up then, and Davy slugged me in the arm as I sat back down. "Can't believe you kept that to yourself all week. I thought Kevin was going to pee his pants." "Was not," Kevin said petulantly, though he looked a little pale, nonetheless. I smiled. Storytelling was something I was good at, and it was always nice to be recognized for my talents. I let my mind slip into the woods around us, hearing the call of a night bird and the whimper of the wind. Perhaps there was something like that out in the woods of the state park. Who could say what lurked in the deep pockets that surrounded areas made for man? I felt myself shiver a little as the wind pushed a sound across my senses, a lonesome sound that sounded eerily like my name. My audience might not be the only one having trouble sleeping tonight. We have so many odd stories on this channel that this one kind of gets lost sometimes. But I can assure you, it is one of the strangest stories that I have ever written, and one of the ones that I like the most because of how odd the subject matter is. So let's hear a little country tale about the honeyed words of Jameson Marsh. When Jameson Marsh, owner of Marsh Mortuaries, put a sign out front of his business saying that he'd be selling honey, people thought he must be joking. What kind of mortician would sell honey? Would he sell it next to the caskets in his showroom? Would he offer it graveside at cemeteries? No one knew. But there was much speculation about that little sign. Those who asked Jameson were in for quite a treat. Jameson told them that he would be selling his honey right here at the mortuary, and even gave them a sample so they might tell their friends. What they sampled was supposedly the best honey any of them had ever eaten. They went on and on about the texture and the taste and the strange exotic flavor within the honey. They said how they couldn't wait for Jameson to sell honey, and they'd be buying as much as they could on opening day. Others began to question where he was keeping his bees. They saw no beehives on his property, a 2-bedroom apartment above the mortuary. They saw no hives on the mortuary property at all, in fact. They saw no hives in the cemetery or near the crematorium. But still, the honey came. On the 3rd of March, the first jar of that miraculous concoction appeared in the front room of Jameson Mortuary. The mortuary was crowded for the next several days, and by Friday, not a jar was left to be purchased. Again, people praised the texture and the taste of his honey, as well as the myriad flavors that one would find within the jar. One of the buyers, Bert Lancaster, owned a large honey operation of his own. It is said that when he tasted Jameson's honey, he proclaimed that no bee in his field had ever produced anything so sweet. Some would tell you that he burned his beehives that very afternoon, but that's little more than town gossip. For that summer back in '86, no one could get enough of Jameson's honey. They say Helen Price used that honey to defeat her rival, Linda Moore, in that summer's 4th of July bake-off. They say Bert Cavell put that honey in his mead and could not make enough of it to satiate the local drunks. They say Mary Sanders was taken to the hospital over in Oakley when she ate 10 jars in a day and was reaching for an 11th when her stomach ruptured. But again, that's all town gossip. What is fact was the discovery made by Randall Smith, a local tabloid writer, in the fall of '86. Randall had a reputation for being less of a journalist and more of a mudslinger. If there was a nasty rumor started, Randall could usually be traced back to it. He'd grown pretty tired of hearing about Jameson and his amazing honey. Randall was of the opinion that if something was too good to be true, then it likely was. He thought Jameson's honey must have some sort of secret ingredient that got people addicted to it. Maybe it was even a cover for some kind of dope operation that Jameson was running out of the mortuary or the cemetery. Whatever the case, Randall could smell a story, and it would be sweeter than any nectar the old mortician could produce. So one night, as the moon hung full over Pleasant Rock Cemetery, Randall and his friends, Rooster Malloy and Charles Drainer, took a trip out to the cemetery to have a look around. Someone had reported earlier that week that they had seen some larger-than-normal bees around the cemetery grounds, and speculated that these may be the source of Jameson's honey. As it was the only lead that Randall had, it seemed as good as any. So after a couple of drinks at the Legion Hall, the 3 men piled into Rooster's old Chevy and headed down to do some late-night snooping. Randall still tells anyone who will listen how the graveyard was as silent as its namesake. The gate was locked, sporting a brand-new Academy security lock, one of the big, thick gold ones that graced the sheds and fences of discerning security buffs in town. So the 3 men had to find a different way in. This was strange, since the cemetery had never been locked before. Jameson had always let people come and go as they please. But just recently, the old man had gotten a little cagey about many things. For one, the cemetery was now locked at nightfall. For another, no one was allowed in the basement of the mortuary, not even the man who came to deliver the bodies for the families. For a third, no one but his 2 sons were allowed to work in the mortuary anymore, and both of them were under pain of death should they reveal the secrets of Jameson's honey. The 3 men had walked around the fence before they found a spot where the last windstorm had knocked down a thick old pine. It lay on the points around the top, creating a rude bridge over the wall. Now, none of them being particularly spry, they had all of them carefully shimmied up the fallen tree and then dropped down into the cemetery, careful not to get stuck on them spikes. They all felt a chill as they stood in the quiet boneyard, and Randall claimed that Rooster looked ready to brave the spikes if it meant being out of there. The wind rattled the skeletal trees on the grounds, and the little flags that had been stuck on some of the graves for Labor Day snapped mischievously and startled them more than once. They had brought flashlights, but the big old trader's moon that looked down on them was more than enough to keep them from tripping into a open grave or smashing their shins on an ill-placed tombstone. The quiet cemetery was enough to sober even the bravest of them, and it was probably why they heard the shovels before they saw the men. Crouching behind a particularly large family headstone, Randall saw 2 men digging into a fresh grave. They were exhuming a body by the light of that pregnant moon, and Randall knew whose it was to boot. We had been to the widow Hadley's funeral that day, and it appeared that whoever these men were, they were taking her from her freshly dug resting place. As they watched, the corpse flopped to the surface most unceremoniously, followed by March's sons, Hannibal and Gavin. Hannibal hefted the body, leaving his younger brother to fill in the hole as he took it deeper into the cemetery. Gavin went to his work, and bent as he was, he didn't notice the three men as they snuck around him and followed his older brother. Hannibal had been a football player, a linebacker for the local school team in his day, and he toted the frail old woman as easily as someone might a sack of corn. As they followed him, the three men weren't sure what they expected to find, but Randall was certain it would be something to add a macabre twinge to the story that he meant to write. They followed Hannibal as he came to a newly built mausoleum, the name across the door reading March. He unlocked the door and unceremoniously tossed the old woman into the crypt. The men hunkered low behind a pair of gravestones, but they needn't have bothered. Hannibal was a big boy, but his night eyes left something to be desired. He no more saw them than he did the place marker that he nearly tripped over on the way back to his brother, and as he stomped off into the cemetery, the three men approached the crypt. The mortuary was a nice new one, sunk into the ground a little to protect any caskets placed down there, and it would have looked more at home in New Orleans than this Georgia backwater town. To the knowledge of anyone in town, the Marches did not have a family crypt until very recently. The only March buried there would be Jameson's wife, since his mother and father were buried up in Macon at their own family plot. Hannibal may not have been the smartest March in town, but it appeared he was smart enough to lock up behind himself. Another one of those big, thick academy locks, the kind that had been on the front gate, greeted the three men as they got to the door, and they were forced to prowl around the mausoleum to see what could be found. It was Charles who found the little vent in the mausoleum, but it was Randall who saw the horrors that lay inside. Randall and Rooster had been looking for a window, or perhaps another entrance, when Charles came hoofing it back to show them that he had found a little vent that opened into the crypt. Randall asked him to show him where it was, and the three men found the little opening, just big enough for a large child to fit inside. Charles and Rooster now were pulp wooders, and much too big to squeeze into holes. Randall, however, had made a career of squeezing into places he was not precisely wanted, opting to stick his head in to get a better look. Randall had his friends hold his legs while he shimmied into the vent. Charles and Rooster slid him in as far as they dared, and they said his flashlight could be seen through the slats at the top of the mausoleum. When Randall started screaming and yelling for them to pull him out, it sounded like the devil himself had gotten hold of him. When they pulled him out, they said he was white as a sheet and said to tell the sheriff immediately. Whether the brothers had gone when they made their escape or not, they missed them entirely as they beat a retreat back to town. Now the sheriff took some convincing to get out of bed, but when Randall told him what they had seen down the crypt, he came with 3 other men and the biggest set of bolt cutters they could find at the station. Jameson's sons were leaving when the sheriff and his boys pulled up, so they didn't end up needing the bolt cutters after all. When he laid it out to the 2 young men that they could either cooperate or sit in the same prison cell with their father, the one he was surely to occupy, they decided it might be in their best interest to show him what they was doing. When the sheriff asked the boys if they would need suits, the 2 shook their heads. Bees are mostly docile, Hannibal told them, and sure enough, when they cracked the door open, not a one came charging out. They descended into the ground, and by the light of the sheriff's flashlight, they saw the horrors below. The bees swarmed the small pile of corpses, taking whatever they used to make the honey, back to their hives. The hives covered the walls of the crypt, making a sticky webwork of catacombs. The corpses down below were fresh, most of them having died very recently, and the bees were taken to them with gusto. The brothers said they came down here once or twice a week to harvest the honey, and that the vulture bees were taken to the warm Georgia summer quite nicely. When the sheriff interrogated them, both said that it had been their father's idea. He had read about vulture bees and thought they sounded like an interesting idea. Then, when their mother died, he'd done a little experiment. He'd put her down in the mortuary and procured some vulture bees of his own. The boys had been horrified when he'd showed them what he'd been up to, but even they had to admit the honey had been the sweetest they had ever eaten. Something about the readily available nature of the local pollen, mixed with the bees' instincts to collect whatever they got from the corpses, had made for a potent and delicious treat. She was the catalyst for all this, Hannibal had said. Those first few jars he handed out to the people for tasting were honey made from our mother's body. He began to cry then, but the sheriff had all the evidence he needed to proceed. He arrested Jameson March that very night, but there seemed to be some confusion on what to charge him with. Couldn't really get him for murder because he hadn't killed anybody. Couldn't really get him for fraud because he buried them bodies just like he said he would. In the end, they got him on simple corpse desecration and a little misdemeanor fraud for not telling the families what he intended to do with them their bodies. He got less than 5 years in prison. I hear the warden let him keep the beehives in the prison garden. Seems like his talents didn't go to waste, not even behind bars. He left town when his time was served, he and his boys. The funeral home's been empty ever since. The police found the beginnings of his beekeeping operation in the basement. That, and a secondary hive with a swarm of agitated vulture bees. Jameson tried to sell the mortuary, but nobody seemed to want a place with that sort of reputation. It collapsed under a late February snow back in 2012, and they destroyed the mausoleum they found all them bodies in about a year after Jameson went to prison. And that's the sordid tale of Jameson March and his bees. I have no idea what they did with those bees after they turned them out of the March mausoleum. They likely just turned them loose into an environment that was alien to them. So, if you should be traveling through the Georgia back roads and see some larger-than-average bees or taste sweeter-than-average honey, be very suspicious about its origins. Looks like we're moving from strange delicacies right back into strange locales, ideally the woods. Some less than lucky orphans, and the forest that they, or their spirits, now call home. Let's hear a story about the kids of Orwin Woods. The job at the gas station was a blessing when they called me, but it would become something of a megrim before I finally quit. I worked the closing shift at the Fill and Go for the better part of 8 months, and it was 8 months of making coffee, stocking coolers, and listening to weary women with too many children argue about what you could and couldn't buy with EBT. My first job was construction, working as a carpenter's assistant until I was 16, and after the big layoff during the pandemic, I was tempted to go back. The amount of construction work hadn't changed, but the call for laborers had waned, it seemed. Suddenly, I was forced to look elsewhere for work, and my savings were starting to get dangerously low. That's when the Fill and Go finally called me. The worst part about the job wasn't even the job itself. Not really. The worst part was the walk home when the day was done. I live in the Shady Oaks trailer court, about 3 blocks from the gas station, and it just made sense to walk to work. I didn't have a car, It was one of the first things to get repoed when I was out of work, so if I needed groceries or booze or just a bite to eat, I was walking. It wasn't much of a problem. I liked to walk, but it was the sights that made the walk unbearable, especially at night. Walking past Orwin Woods in the middle of the night was enough to give anybody the shivers. Orwin Wood had existed long before the children's home that had given it its name, but the long-gone orphanage is why it was infamous. Established in 1890, Orwin Children's Home was a place for cast-off children from all over. The rambling plantation home, lovingly donated by Mrs. Orwin before she died, boasted 30 acres, complete with a barn, field for growing, and a pond for fishing and swimming, and a lot of room for rowdy growing kids, of course. At its peak, it had held some 120 kids, and had been a place of new beginnings and fresh starts for many of the lost boys and girls in the area. Those were not the reasons it was remembered, however. The reason it was still whispered about at fireside stories was the fire of 42. By 1942, the orphanage had finally fallen into disrepair. They had some 30-odd kids they were caring for, and the consensus was that the fire may have been set for reasons of insurance fraud. Others claim it was a candle that was left lit in a bedroom or a stray spark from the fireplace. But however it was started, the results had been devastating. 30 people lost their lives in the fire, 25 of them children, and that was when the stories began. You could still see the ruins of the children's home as it hulked in the undergrowth, reclaimed by the forest after the blaze, and the area around the hulk was supposed to be very haunted. Lots of people had seen ghostly apparitions, handprints on the dirt on their cars, or had toys glide into the road without warning. The Orwin Woods played in a lot of local legends, and it was widely agreed upon to be a haunted place. I explain all this so you understand why I might have been a little eager to get home on my evening walks. Nothing strange had ever happened to me, nothing besides that feeling of unseen eyes watching me, at least not till last night. Last night, I got off work to find about a foot of fresh snow on the ground. I'd been expecting it. I had been watching it come down all day as I rang up coffee and gas for customers. I had walked to work through flurries earlier that day and had dressed accordingly. Still, I thought as I pulled my hood up and turned to lock the door behind me, that wouldn't stop it from being a cold, wet walk home. The dark gas station disappeared behind me as I started schlepping home, tonight's cigarette already between my teeth. It was a terrible habit, I know, but it's the only vice I can afford to have these days. Tonight, however, I was having a hell of a time getting the tip lit. Every time I would lift my lighter to spark it, the wind would pick up and blow my little flame out. Cold as it was, however, the shiver that passed up my neck had nothing to do with it, as I came even with Orwin Woods. I tried not to look as I walked past, the forest a dark shadow on my left. Like almost any night, I could already feel those phantom eyes as they marked my passing, and I kept my gaze firmly ahead. My grandma had always told me that when you sense the supernatural taking notice of you, it's best not to let it know you see it. Some things don't like being seen, Bug. Remember that, she would say, and it made a lot of sense on nights like tonight. I was still trying to get the cigarette to kindle, but the wind was keeping me from my evening smoke. I put a hand up to block it, but it seemed my fingers weren't even good enough for this capricious gust. The unlit cigarette was a good distraction from the creepy woods, however, though maybe a little too good. If it hadn't been for the snow, I would have walked home without incident, but I suppose I could have also unknowingly let something follow me in, too. Suddenly, I was done with the games. I was jonesing for a smoke, and I bent almost double as I tried to spark the tip. 3 clicks and a lot of cursing later, I managed to get the flames to stick. But as I took that first long drag of gaseous pleasure, I noticed something beside me on the sidewalk. It was a pair of footprints. No, not just any footprints. A pair of children's footprints. I don't mean shoe prints either. I could count the individual toes in these prints, and there was a line of them beside my much larger ones. I didn't know when they had picked up my trail, but I didn't really care either. Whoever had made them had disappeared, and I looked around curiously. It was 22 degrees outside, so my phone said when I left the station, and I was looking for the kid bold enough to walk barefoot in the snow. There was no one, though, and no footprints going hastily away from mine either. I was alone in the snow, though the fact that they had stopped right next to my own let me know I might not be as alone as I thought. I glanced back, wanting to see I'd been mistaken, and that's when I saw the second set. They had stopped about 5 feet behind me, but they were just as plain as the first ones. As the wind hit me again, I tried to keep my teeth from chattering. The chill I felt had nothing to do with the weather, and I found my eyes drawn to the new pair as they waited patiently for some sign. 2 perfect pairs of tiny footprints, sitting placidly in the powder. Then before my eyes, a third set came crunching towards me, and my cigarette made an angry hiss as it hit that fresh snow. I was running before that third set came even with the second, and this seemed to be the sign they'd been waiting for. I heard those bare feet as they slapped wetly on the concrete behind me. My head cried out for caution. It would be very easy to take a tumble out here and get hurt, but my desire to get away was up, and my adrenaline was coursing in the face of that formless threat. I slid as I rounded the corner, but my sneakers held purchase as I kept showing my heels. I could feel the burn in my chest as I ran, my breath steaming like a loco as I ran for my life, and I knew if they caught me, I would never see home again. None of the stories I ever heard about the woods spoke of children hurting anyone, but by the sound of those ghostly feet, I guess they weren't going to sell me cookies. By the sound of it, there were more than a dozen of them after me, and I could just imagine the intention of this legion. I saw the trailer park coming into sight, but that seemed to be where my luck ran out. I came off the curb, running flat out, and when I hit a patch of ice, I stumbled and went down hard on my outstretched hands. I was lucky, I suppose. If I'd hit my head and gone unconscious, there's no telling if I would have ever woken up again. As it was, I just gashed my hands on the concrete beneath. I could still hear them behind me, getting closer and closer, and I walked on my hands and knees until I got across the street and managed to right myself. I was running up the narrow walkway, dashing between the trailers as I saw my faded red one coming into sight. I prayed the stairs wouldn't be icy, and when my foot touched down on the first step, I was rewarded with a groan and the firmness of unfrozen wood. I darted up the steps, crossed the porch, and rammed the key into the lock as I frantically walked into the entryway. I sighed in relief. I was home, and nothing could hurt me here. I turned and slammed the door, the screen door not feeling quite firm enough, but my hands stopped. I saw my breath as it came puffing out, and it felt as if it were thicker than usual. There were dozens of footprints in the snow outside my trailer. Some were in the yard, some were on the porch, but all of them led to the front door. It was as if all those kids had followed me home, each of them beckoning to be let inside so they could come out of the cold. I could just picture a dozen or more half-burnt children, the snow falling on their ruined skin, looking hopefully at me as if just asking for a place by the fire. It was all too much, and when I slammed the door shut, there was a note of finality to it. I made a mental note to try and find a new route home, but the situation, it seemed, had fixed itself. I was awoken at 6 a.m. the next day by my boss telling me that Dixie, his day manager, had called to tell him that she quit this morning. Run off with her damn boyfriend and good riddance, I say. You've been a solid night guy, but I figured I'd offer you a chance to come work days if you want. The position comes with an extra $3 an hour, but you'd have to start today. You interested? I was, and the forest seemed a lot less spooky in the daylight. I haven't encountered any more phantom footprints after that night, but I'll never forget how that ghostly mob chased me home one cold February night. One last story for you, and I really like this next one. I know I say that one a lot, but this was also one of my stranger ideas, and I think it turned out pretty good. So, let's take a deep look into a new product that I think you're just gonna love. Something that could be in your own living room soon, if you play your cards right. A little something called the Infinity Table.
I've been an artist for a few years now. I went to school with people whose understanding of art stopped at watercolors and still lifes, but those never really were my thing. I like to be experimental in my work, really push the boundaries of art. My high school art teacher, Mr. Caff, never really understood that, but it's probably hard to understand much of anything with your head firmly crammed up your backside. He was one of those types who thought the Renaissance was the birth and death of the artistic expression, and that digital art was tantamount to blasphemy. He did not tolerate modern art in his classroom, and I likely wouldn't still be doing art if it wasn't for Terry. Terry and I met in art class freshman year, and we've been friends ever since. Terry is your textbook manic pixie dream girl, and her artistic medium is pop art with a soft spot for comics. She did all those reimaginings of classic comic covers, always in heavy oils and deep, saturated colors, and her work is really something to behold. Mr. Caff may not have understood her medium, but he understood her process, so she made straight B's in his class. I have a theory that he was trying to get into her ripped blue jeans, but manic pixie dream girls rarely fall for the middle-aged high school teacher, so tough break, Teach. The old bastard tried to fail me, on the other hand, but I rose above it, and now I'm one of the most well-known modern artists in the city, likely to his chagrin. My art is far from what you'd consider classical. I make sculptures from various mediums, do charcoal prints, weird displays of paints and acrylics, and recently I've begun doing metalwork sculptures in something I'm calling transitory mundane. The basic premise is that you take something normal, a refrigerator or a couch or a TV, and make it utterly mind-blowing. My horror fridge took first place at last year's Fall Gala, and my TV-pocalypse made the paper earlier this year. This time, however, I've got something really interesting in mind. Terry raised an eyebrow as I pulled the cover off my latest art project. I call it the Infinity Table. Terry looked dubiously at the rectangular living room table, a thick piece of glass sitting propped over a dark opening. It just looks like a regular table to me. I'm not sure what kind of concept you're going for, but I don't get it. I grinned as I leaned down, flicking a switch as the inside lit up to reveal the trick. Through mirror placement and strategic lighting, the inside of the table resembles nothing so much as a black pit that proceeds downward into infinity. A ladder was installed on the side and seemed to descend down into the pit. The mirror magnified it on and into the void. Terry's jaw dropped open as she oohed appreciatively over the illusion. The rocks on the walls and the crystal lighting, a really nice touch if I do say so myself. That is so cool! It's so simple yet intriguing. Everyone's going to want one after the show next week. But only one of them will get it. I think this may be my greatest art piece yet. The two of us cackled over my brilliance, and Terry told me about the panel series she planned to do for her own entry. Terry had been hard at work on an original comic series, so tired of bringing others' works to life and not getting to work on her own stuff. She was debuting a series of oil paintings from her own personal collection, and she hoped they would drum up some interest for upcoming series. I was listening, really I was, but my eyes kept being drawn back down to that yawning chasm that lay in the center of the table. It was an illusion. I knew it was an illusion. I had made it after all, but I couldn't keep myself from feeling the sightless black eye as it stared at me. It had discomforted me before, the way a scary movie makes you shiver even after it's over, but I always managed to shrug it off. I had created the illusion. I knew it wasn't real, but I could still swear that something lurked within it. I knew it didn't, but it still intrigued me. I was like a bird that knows the bag will trap him, but still wants to know what lies inside. Like a man who knows that the void stares back, but goes right on staring. Hello? Are you even listening to me? I shook myself back and apologized for spacing out. I flipped the light out on the table, and it was once again reduced to a black crater. Even turned off, I still felt like I could feel that inky mass looking at me, and I didn't like the crawling, scrabbling way it seemed to contemplate me. It had never looked at me like this during its creation, and it seemed to have gained a life of its own with its completion. It's cool and all, but I'm kind of glad you turned it off. I looked up as Terry shuddered, and the discomfort was an alien concept on her normally whimsical face. It scares me a little bit. I smiled, but I knew all too well what she meant. That's why Terry was my best friend. It was sometimes like we shared a brain. How did you even come up with something like this? She asked, still sounding equal parts terrified and amazed. I started to rattle off something about pure talent or the muse at work, but I honestly couldn't remember how I had thought of it. Had it been in a dream? It seemed like I had been inspired by something to build this piece, but I couldn't remember what. I had been so driven the last few weeks to finish it that I never really stopped to think why. Hello, you spacing out on me again? Terry laughed, snapping her fingers in front of my face. I shook my head, getting a grip before answering. Just the muse at work, I guess. I took her out for drinks then, wanting to forget about the feeling that dark eye had given me, as much as she did, but it was never far from my mind. When I stumbled back that night, the few drinks turning into a few too many drinks, I stood over the table and looked down into the dark, unlit eye. Even drunk, I felt the regard of that hateful space, and it sobered me a little. I could feel it staring at me through the flimsy haze that lay between us, and the dark hole seemed to long for its freedom again. I reached for the switch with a shaky hand, the mechanism snapping crisply as it came to life. The light came on, but it was cold comfort. The hole stretched into the earth, a dark and gaping maw that filled me with dread. Why had I created this thing? How did it occur to me to make such a hateful portal? How had I conceptualized this? The longer I looked into it, the more certain I became that I could see something at the bottom. It seemed to move within the dark eye, with frantic, herky-jerky movements. It moved like something in a claymation cartoon, and its regard was like wasps crawling on my skin. I didn't know what it was, couldn't even tell you how big it was, but as my hands trembled back towards the switch, I saw one thing for sure. It had begun to climb the ladder. The light snapped off with a smart pop, and I was left once more with only the dark haze across the glass. I went to bed, but my dreams were plagued by that bottomless eye and that thing that moved within. I didn't turn it on again until the day of the show. I honestly debated just pushing it into an alley behind my apartment and forgetting it ever existed, but I had too much time and money invested in the project to just walk away. The components hadn't come without a cost, and the prize money, not to mention the money I would make once it was sold, would allow me to do art for another few months. If it flopped at the show, I might have to actually find a job, and that would be the biggest blow to the art community imaginable. So I loaded it into the back of my ratty old pickup, the camper allowing it to ride in relative safety, and drove it to the gallery. I had secured it with a rope, not wanting it to tip over and break, despite my misgivings. I could tell myself that I kept checking the rear view the whole time just to make sure it wasn't getting damaged, but that was a lie. I wanted to make sure that nothing simply climbed out of it as I drove through the crowded streets of Seattle to what I hoped would be a feather in the cap of my career. My neighbor had helped me load the table. Beefy neighbors have to be good for something, right? And thankfully, there were burly men in black security shirts to help me unload it. They did most of the unloading and reloading onto the hand dolly, too, which was good because it had taken everything I had to put my hands on it as we loaded it into the truck. It had sat like a revered monolith in my living room for the past week. After I had woken up that first morning to a hangover and the sunlight illuminating the pit under that all-too-thin pane of glass, I had covered it with a tarp. I hadn't touched it, hadn't sat anything on it, hadn't even let my feet lean against it the whole week, and the thought of its surface against my skin made me feel crawly. I couldn't remember why I had been so excited about this thing, and only a feeling of deep revulsion filled me when I looked at it. If no one bought it, I had decided I would donate it to the gallery after the show. At least I could write that off on my taxes. Terry waved at me as she saw me coming in, and her little bird arms seemed ready to pop as she wrapped them around me. "I see you didn't get rid of it," she said with a smile, though her voice sounded strained. Terry wouldn't say so, but she seemed to feel the same trepidation I felt around the piece. I figured that someone would buy it, and who knows, the judges might really like it. She showed me her prints, scenes of dramatic heroes poised for battle, and spiraling cityscapes that oozed adventure, and I made the appropriate noises over them. It was always impressive what she could do with oils and paints, but tonight she had really outdone herself. I gave her another hug, wishing her luck as I pushed my hateful table over to the area that had been designated for me. A passing pair of lost frat boys helped me get it off the dolly, and far too soon I was left alone with this blight upon the world. I didn't turn it on. I honestly didn't really want to look at it, and I just contented myself to stand there as people bustled by and set up their own pieces for the show. 20 minutes later, my mind wandering, someone called my name, and I turned to find a stern-faced woman looking down at my piece. "What is it?" she asked, a ribbon on her shirt letting me know that, though she wasn't a judge, she was still very important. The ribbon let everyone know that she was a contributor, the color putting her in a high tier. "It's called an infinity table," I told her, her scowl not impressed. I reached down, my fingers trembling, and flipped the switch. I expected to see an angry something looking back at me, the glass bearing long cracks where something had battered it from the other side. But instead, it was just the same dark eye as always. It regarded the two of us with an unfriendly familiarity, and the stern-looking woman looked impressed as she took it all in. Very interesting. Not my style, but very interesting. You should leave it on if you want anyone to buy it. The endless tunnel is a definite selling point. I waited for her to move away before switching it off again. She had a point. If I wanted to get rid of this hateful thing, I needed people to see what it could do. The fear of something climbing out of it seemed silly now, as all these people stood around me, but it was a silly feeling that wouldn't abate. In the end, my greed overrode my fear, and I flipped it on so I could draw in some interest. Interest I found. People came over to have a look, and there was a fair amount of oohing and awing. They asked how I had done it, wanted one of their own, but I told them it was a one-of-a-kind piece and would likely carry a steep price tag. All the while, my eyes kept flitting back to the crevice in the center of the table, as though I expected to see something crawl up from the depths. I could see, or at least I imagined I could see, the stunted figure as he stalked about at the bottom of the pit. It was trapped there. This was its prison, and now I had given it a means of escape. I had invited it out of the pit, and now it could come into our world, and wow, how did you ever come up with something so cool? I started. Someone new had come up to ask about the infinity table, and I told them again about the concept. It all sounded so false to me now. I hadn't come up with the concept, though I could certainly talk about it in an educated manner. What a smart little bird I was. I could talk oh so prettily about my new project, using all the right buzzwords and trendy lingo to catch all these yuppies' attention. I was an artist. I created art, but I was beginning to feel like something else. This was beginning to feel like I was being used. Despite these misgivings, the show was going pretty well. People loved the infinity table. They thought it was really cool and a great perspective piece. I had a few tentative offers, but nothing serious. I would have probably taken the first offer, but the hole in the table kept distracting me. As I talked to people, I could see the small something beginning to climb the ladder again. It was still very small, like a fly crawling on a window pane, but as it climbed, it got larger and larger with each rung it grabbed. There was no way this could be real. I had built the thing. There was no hole in the void. It was all an optical illusion. Even so, the small creature was climbing up and up and up as these stupid airheads talked on and on about how much they loved my table. "Hey, you okay?" I jumped, realizing I'd been staring at the table for nearly 5 minutes. Terry was there, a well-dressed man grinning on her arm. Terry wasn't tall, but this guy looked like he might have had some hobbits in his family tree. He was short, hairy, dressed in a luxury white suit with a gold chain and a lot of very aggressive chest hair. I wasn't certain I could smell him. There were a lot of sweaty bodies, mine chief among them, but there was a definite tang of musky cologne and fragrant soap. Terry was smiling, but the smile looked paper-thin as the man, whom I was already calling Leisure Suit Larry in my head, rubbed his arm against her hip. "This is Clive," she said, indicating Larry as she slid herself free of him. "He liked my art so much that he decided to buy all 5 pieces. I just knew he had to see your infinity table, so I brought him over here to have a look." Translation, Leisure Suit Larry was Loaded Larry, and she was hoping she could solve both our problems. Larry had sized me up as she spoke, and I could feel my skin crawl under his less than altruistic stare. I consider myself a lover of art, amongst other things. Did you make this? He asked, looking down into the table as his eyes seemed to dazzle as they took in the sight of the gaping pit. I did, I began, but before I could say anything else, I looked down at the table and felt my throat constrict. He was bigger now, the size of a thumbprint, and climbing fast. He was speeding up, climbing rapidly, and I wasn't sure how the others couldn't see him. Did they not see the shadowy little creature as it grew from a thumbprint to the size of a silver dollar? Larry was saying something, complimenting my work, but all I could focus on was the growing spot of black as it climbed like a mad thing. "I'm sold, love," he said to Terry, the word love making her flinch. "I'll pay you $30,000 for it." I couldn't speak. My throat was a stupid machine, incapable of doing anything but killing me slowly. The thing was twice as large now, growing quickly. I had no clue what I would do if it got to the glass and just started banging on that thin sheet of tempered material. Larry was looking right at it, his nose inches from the tabletop. How could he not see it? Playing hard to get, huh? Okay, 40,000 then. I could make out the top of its head, its face turned up to look at the land above. Its eyes were like twin coals, its mouth open in a leering grin, and its hands were covered in hair or tar or something. Its body was like an undiluted shadow, a golem of darkness that was climbing like a fiend to get at the lighted world above. It seemed like I might have unintentionally created performance art, I thought with a weak little gasp. Escape from purgatory in real life. Terry slid her hand into mine and squeezed, bringing me out of my panic. "What's wrong?" she whispered, seeing my face and sensing my fear. "You're a tease, aren't you?" Larry said, looking up from the table coyly. "Fine, but 50,000 is as high as I'll go unless you agree to have drinks with me after the show. Then I might be willing to go up to 60. "Sold," I squeaked out, afraid he would take it all back and leave me with this thing. He extended a hand over the table. As I shook it, I could see the creature's face coming closer and closer to the top. I pumped his arm twice before bending down to snap the light off. Can you take it now?" I asked him, my voice sounding frantic even to my own ears. "Don't you want the judges to see it?" Terry asked, a little confused. The panel of 3 judges were just coming to the display area, but I didn't want this thing close to me for more than a second. The hell with the judges. The fear inside me was like a starving weasel, and I feared it would burst through my chest any minute. "Can you?" I asked again, looming over him. He nodded dumbly, taking out his checkbook and scrawling out a business check. I took it, and he pulled out his cell phone as he made some calls. He excused himself, and before Terry could ask any more questions, I pocketed the check and left the gallery. I met her later for drinks, and she said Larry had excused himself after the purchase. He said he wanted to get it loaded and set up in his own exhibition right away. I think you scared him with your intensity a little. We laughed about it then, my soul lighter now that I didn't have to look at that hateful table anymore. I hadn't thought about that table until yesterday, about a week and a half after the gala. The check had been cashed, and the money had easily floated my art career for the next few years. I'd paid some bills, paid my outstanding credit card debt, and began living pretty comfortably off the excess. I was sitting on my couch, watching Netflix and eating a bowl of cereal for dinner, when my phone buzzed. It was Terry. She had sent me a news article along with a message telling me that I should watch it. "Your art piece just made the news in New York," she told me, and the lack of emojis and lols made me a little wary. I opened it up to find an article about a murder at the gallery of Clive Foreman. The proprietor, Mr. Foreman, had been found dead in his gallery in Soho Tuesday morning. He appeared to have been drowned, though no water could be found in his lungs or on the ground around him. Doctors say it's as though he simply drowned on the floor of his gallery and was left there. The next picture was of a very familiar table. It had been broken, and the glass lay gaping and jagged like an untreated wound. The article went on to say that the murderer had left a message on the wall in either tar or some kind of oil, and as I scrolled to the next picture, I felt the phone slip out of my numb hand. The message on the wall seemed to glower at me from the floor, and I drew my knees up to my chest as I tried to make myself stop hyperventilating. It read, "Your muse is free. My prison is no more."
Looks like we're done for another day. But don't worry. I'm sure we'll be back very soon with more great stories spent around a cozy fire with yours truly, Dr. Plague. So until then, I'd like to wish you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.